Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and today we've got a really interesting video because I want to build my next PC inside an NZXT H1 and I want to water cool it. So that is what we're going to be focusing on today, and for a few reasons, because we know that the all-in-one liquid coolers inside these things don't have a great reliability rating. We've seen from the H1 version 1 that gunk can build up in the water block, and that just means that you have to either send it back for an RMA or you have to disassemble it and clean it and flush it, like I've got in a video that's proving very, very popular, unfortunately, as a lot more of you are finding issues with these cases. What I will be doing today is showing you how to fit a very simple, affordable custom liquid loop into both of these cases. We're going to be focusing on the version 2 because that's what my new PC is going to be going into. But we are going to be looking at how to dismantle and what components you can use in the version 1 as well. The components that we've got are a combined pump and water block from WATERCOOL. We've got an WATERCOOL radiator as well. We've also got a Gigabyte Z690i Aorus Ultra Plus mini ITX motherboard, and we have a fabulous palette, RTX 4070 Ti Gaming Pro. So all of that's going to be going into my shiny new PC. We're going to be looking at how to water cool both of these cases and how to strip them down. I'm also going to be swapping out the power supply in the version 2 because the stock power supply, the SFX power supply that's included with it, is absolutely awful. It's really noisy, so I'm going to be swapping it out for something that's a little quieter. So super interesting video that we've got today, but not before we get to the subscribe button. Make sure you hit it and turn on notifications so you are notified of new upcoming videos that I'm going to release very, very soon. Lots of fan reviews, slim fan reviews in particular, and a whole bunch of other stuff besides. Don't forget to like and comment on this video as well, and let's get cracking. So here we have our liquid cooling system, and this is what we're going to be using alongside some clear tubing, which we don't really need to show you because it's just tubing, but these are the core components that we want to talk about here. First of all, we have the Alphacore Ice Bear LT. So this is essentially a compact combined pump and reservoir. I had the choice of a couple of items here. I could have used EK's new combined pump, reservoir and water block, but it was a bit too tall. So this thing is still pretty tall, but it's a lot shorter than the EK option, and this will mean that it doesn't really sit that much higher than the stock pump in the NZXT H1 anyway. And as I've checked the clearances, we can actually fit a fan and a radiator or opposite, basically sitting on the side panel on the NZXT H1 in a minute, and I'll show you what I mean. But this thing is super cool, very compact. It's powered by your motherboard or a separate fan header power cable. So you've got RGB lighting. You've also got a three pin fan header cable there, so you can power it using the voltage mode from your motherboard. That just sits on top of your CPU, and as you can see there, it's a fully fledged water block. There's a pump inside, and you've got a fill port here. So you can actually have a very, very compact liquid cooling system, and this is a pretty affordable as well. I'll put all the pricing up down below, as well as links to all the components, so you can do your own build with these components if you want to. But this basically saves you having to buy a separate pump and reservoir. It's not so much cost saving, it's just kind of cramming stuff into a very, very tight space, which of course the NZXT H1 is. So to squeeze everything in, we've got some angled fittings here. So I think this is 13mm tubing, so 13mm outside diameter, 10mm inside diameter, just standard flexible tubing. Need the angled fittings because it's very, very tight in there. We basically want to hook things around at 90 degrees from the radiator and the water block. So these things will kind of be sitting on there like so. So we've got the fittings, and the last thing we need is the radiator. Now the clearances, we're going to see how much we can actually get away with in the case, but so far I've done a test fit of one of these, which is Alphacool's ST20 radiator. Specifically, this is the 140mm version, so essentially a pretty good replacement for the 140mm version or 140mm radiator already in the NZXT H1. And what we'll see is basically I'm going to aim to fit at least a half height fan or a slim fan on here. We've got a couple of slim fans that we can use. If I can't fit, or if I can fit one of those, what I might try and do is dial up to a full height fan and see how we go from there. So I'm mainly concerned about matching the cooling performance of the cooler that's already in there. This radiator will almost certainly do it because we've got a copper core dense fin radiator here. So if we can fit a full height fan on here, that will be great. If not, we'll definitely go with a slim fan, and then we should get similar cooling to the stock cooler configuration in the NZXT H1 version 2. So to match the layout of the tubing in the NZXT H1, we need to use some angled fittings, and they need to be pointing to the outside of the radiator. The reason for this is because there's very little clearance between the radiator and the tubing and where the motherboard sits, so you kind of had to have the tubing pointing outwards so you can then lift the radiator up on its rails and install it into the case. So here we've got the AlphaCool Ice Bayer LT, the combined pump, water block and reservoir. Not a massive reservoir in this thing, so it's kind of like pretty much a direct fill, but it just saves having to fit a reservoir into the case separately. Again, here we need to use angled fittings because there's not going to be enough room to have the tubing kind of coming out straight from the motherboard. We need to angle it, so this is what we'll be doing on the motherboard. Something else we have to do is to remove the USB hub, which controls the fans and the pump through NZXT cam. Will now be controlling them directly from the motherboard and its EFI, but Gigabyte has a pretty good EFI for controlling these things, so that's not too much of a loss. And it also frees up a bit of space in the side of the case, so if you did want to mod it and clear some space for a larger radiator or other components, removing the hub is a very good way of doing that. So you just need to make sure that all the cables are detached and then you can remove it. Moving on to disassemble the case then, and we have to remove the radiator. So I've already removed the radiator screws here, so it is detached from the internal bracket, which means that we can just lift both of these things out and then separate them before removing all the components and tubing. One of the things I loved about the H1 was how neatly everything was put together, and NZXT did a pretty good job of pre-cable tidying a lot of the components and cables inside, but we need to detach these cable ties so we can remove the rest of the hardware. Now, if you want to fit a larger radiator in the case, you can, but you will need to remove an internal section of the case to fit a 280mm radiator like this AlphaCool one that we've got here. The internal plate that we're talking about is attached to the motherboard tray. You'll need to Dremel it out, and you will also need to move the power supply compartment over, which means removing the 92mm fan as well. So just a word of warning if you're considering doing that. The fan that I'm going to be using is the Johnsbo HS1415. This is a slim 140mm fan with RGB lighting. I could have also used a similar model from Arctic, but I just went with this one for now. Okay, so here we are with the motherboard, and as usual with a mini ITX build, especially a kind of custom, never done before one like this one, you always run into some problems. And the fittings that I was using, specifically these ones from AlphaCool, I hadn't actually measured to check whether they passed the heatsink and M.2 kind of double stacked array down on the bottom of the board. So we've got the very, very large heatsink here, and as we've seen on quite a few other mini ITX motherboards, this posed a problem with this cooler as well, because the only ports you've got to play with the AlphaCool Ice Bayer LT are these ones on the side. And as you can see, I don't have the AlphaCool fittings on here anymore. What I do have are some EK micro fittings, because these ones are the only ones that fit. Now, the problem I had is that when you had the water block sitting on here, you would basically foul the SSD, and you would foul a pin that you would use to mount the heatsink as well. So here's the heatsink, and the pin kind of sits around there. I've actually prized it off now. That pin would essentially foul the ports, and there was no way, any which way, that this thing was gonna fit. So in the end, what I had to do is not only get some EK micro fittings, so these things are an absolute godsend for very, very tight situations. Can highly recommend them. That I think they're about 12mm or something from top to bottom, maybe a little bit more. I'll have to check on the specifications. But what they have allowed me to do is to fit this thing in here. Now, what I did have to do, as I mentioned, is just pry off this heatsink mounting pin off the M.2 array down here. You can just see the hole of where it did sit. So I'm going to keep that in the box just in case I want to sell the motherboard or something at a later date. I can just kind of put that back in with some adhesive and it will be good as new. And it's only just there just to kind of have a hole or a supporting hole for one of the long M.2 mounting screws, which you can see here. So it's just that kind of slides through, goes through that hole and down into the thread below. So now what we can do is fit this thing. This is the only way it fits around. It doesn't fit any other way. It clashes with the memory, it clashes with that heatsink, it clashes with this heatsink over here. That's the only way it's going to fit. So this may or may not work depending on which motherboard you are actually using. You're going to have to just check and see whether it's going to work for you in terms of the dimensions. I will put the dimensions for the ports on the bottom to see the clearance between one of the CPU mounting socket holes and the edge of the fitting down here, so you can hopefully make that assessment for yourself. Obviously, if you've got anything kind of down this end of the board, it's going to be touch and go as to whether it will work or not, which is a real pain because I wanted this to be as compatible with as many people out there as possible, but sadly it looks like it's going to be a little bit tricky. The other alternative is to use one of WATERCOOL's GPU AIO liquid coolers that you strap to a water block. They have an integrated pump, and that way all you'd need to do is include a water block in that loop as well, and then you'll be plain sailing. So I'll put links to those components in the description down below as well. And I might hit up WATERCOOL to see if we can look at one of those at some point to see how it might affect our NZXT H1 build here. So for now, we are sorted. We have this ready to install and we're going to go ahead and install it. Then we can fit everything else back into the case. So here we have the double stacked M.2 module and we've got two crucial 4TB PCI Express 4 SSDs mounted in here. And the top side, because we've got rid of the stock heatsink, we've got a Be Quiet MC1 Pro M.2 heatsink there instead, and that allows us to fit the water block in place with those super tiny EK micro fittings. So here we're just reinstalling some of the original screws so that we can hold this M.2 module in place because it does have a habit of coming loose. So just applying some thermal paste, we've already attached the screws and springs to the Ice Bear LT water block and pump. So we just now need to go ahead and screw these into the backplate. With the water block installed, we can install some straight fittings for 13 10mm tubing this time, so we can run the tubing around inside the case and hopefully avoid any kinks. I like to get my own countersunk screws, especially when I'm dealing with very, very tight spaces like this one, because I don't really want any of the screw heads protruding. And as you can see here, these countersunk screws fit perfectly into the fan frame, and these are 20mm M3 screws designed to fit AlphaCool radiators, and you can pick them up online or in most DIY stores. With the radiator installed back into the original position, I then added a couple of right angle fittings and then added long lengths of tubing which wrapped around inside the case in a similar way to the AIO liquid cooler originally, allowing you to extend the side panel on its hinges to flip out the radiator and just have the tubes extend outwards. The only thing I had to do is add a small anti-kink tube to one of the lengths to stop the tube kinking, and the other one proved to be absolutely fine, and the side panels would just kind of slide over the extended tubing there, so everything is in and there's plenty of clearance. So before we install all of the hardware, what I wanted to do is to fill the loop and do that without any of the hardware connected, because the only fill port on this thing is on the water block itself. So I don't really want to have water like right there when I'm powering on the system. So it's a good practice anyway to use an ATX jumper like this, and you connect this to the end of your power supply without any of the other cables powered on, and if you have the power supply turned on, then this will turn the power supply on alone, and you can connect things like pumps and or fans and those kind of things to your power supply and have those power up, but none of your other hardware is on. So if we have a leak down here or in some other part of the tubing and it goes all over the hardware, it's not going to kill the hardware. So that's a very, very useful way of making sure a system like this is not going to leak. I've already done a leak test and it's absolutely fine, but obviously you might not have a leak tester at home and you might just want to play it safe for the time being. And just through filling this thing up, it's going to be much, much easier to use an ATX jumper and fill it first, and then we can install our hardware. So this one has actually got a little power button on there as well, so you can easily flick it on and off, turning the power supply on and off. And if you can see here, I've got the fan connected to the power supply at the moment. You see, turn it on, the fan turns on, turn it off, and the fan is off again. So we're now going to connect the pump to the power supply, and then we're going to fill the system. So you can hear that? Neither can I, which is amazing. I'm seriously impressed with how quiet the AlphaCool iSpay LT is. So that's going to be great for this build. So all we've got to do now is just try and get a few more of the air bubbles out. There's just maybe 1 or 2 more hanging around. Then I can continue installing the hardware. The test system we're using is a Core i7-12700K, which is running at stock speed, and we are running the Cinebench 10-minute burn-in test, which loads all cores in a multi-threaded scenario. So the temperatures that we've got here are the average temperature across the P cores. So some P cores might be slightly higher, most are a little bit lower. So the temperatures that we've got then are 90 degrees C for the custom loop and 88 degrees C for the stock cooler. So it might come as a bit of a surprise that the custom loop is actually slightly warmer than the stock AIO liquid cooler, but there are a couple of very good reasons for that. First of all, we're using a slim fan, which is around a centimetre shorter, or thinner, should I say, than a standard fan, so it's going to generate less static pressure and less airflow. And we are also using a slim radiator, which is 20mm thick instead of 30mm thick, so there's just less cooling capacity there. So not totally surprising to see these results. The benefits, though, are profound. This system, the cooling system, was much, much quieter. Even though we just see a tiny uptick in the CPU temperature, the pump was pretty much inaudible above all the rest of the hardware. But I couldn't really hear it at all, to be honest. And the fan was a lot quieter than the one included with the AIO liquid cooler. So there are a couple of ways that we could boost that cooling. We could use a full height 140mm fan in this system, and that's pretty easy to do. There is just about enough clearance, but I just went with the slim fan in this build just so I knew that I'd be able to fit it, and it's something very easy for you guys to follow and to do yourself at home. So can't stress enough how much quieter this system is, especially as we've also swapped out the very noisy NZXT power supply for a Corsair SF750 as well. So for NZXT H1 version 1 owners, that is what we have here. Now I've performed a couple of modifications, well not really modifications, I haven't even had to modify anything yet, but I've just stripped out some of the hardware such as the cradle that holds the power supply. So that usually sits about up there like so, if I can just wiggle it in. Yeah, so it fits there, and then you have this bracket kind of coming over, and that secures to two holes on here. So the SFXL power supply in here, a little bit quieter than the one in the version 2, which is a standard SFX model, so it's nice to have that extra space. But there's a very, very interesting tweak that you can do with this case, is if you remove that bracket entirely, this thing is kind of what stops you installing a larger radiator in the other case, in the version 2. But here, it is critically, it is separate to the motherboard tray. So if you get rid of this, obviously you're losing the power supply mount, but we'll get to that in a minute. If you remove that, this is what you can do. So this is a 280mm radiator, and bear in mind this case is actually smaller than the version 2. A little bit of a wiggle. That fits in there absolutely fine. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and chop this off as well, you could actually secure the radiator to this mount, and this is a 280mm radiator. I think I actually need to swap that around so the ports are at the lower end, which is what they are when the all-in-one liquid cooler is installed as well. So you would literally be able to secure it about there. So we've got a mounting hole appearing there and on the other side. And this whole thing would actually swing out, which is amazing. So you can actually have that awesome functionality of the H1 where the radiator kind of swings out and this whole thing comes out like that. So absolutely amazing. And as you can see here, it doesn't quite, if you secure it to that mounting hole there, it doesn't quite clear this. But if I just nudge it over a little bit, it actually swings out. So that is a 280mm radiator in this case. Now, back to the power supply, because that is now loose inside the case. All you'd need to do is just secure some 3M mounting tape at the top. Some of this stuff, which it basically, once you get it on, you'd need to basically drop the case off a cliff to actually get that power supply to move again. Obviously, potentially a bit of an issue when you come to remove the power supply if you ever needed to do that, but you can just dislodge it with a screwdriver or something like that. That stuff, or even just like some Velcro or something like that. Maybe not Velcro, it probably doesn't hold it strong enough. I would definitely use this. Or create your own custom mount. But if you secured that power supply flat against the motherboard tray down here and secured it like so, that is going to be an absolutely awesome way to gain a couple of extra inches of clearance. As you can see here, we've got that, all that clearance that you can see there is now free for a fan and a radiator, and I can tell you now there is definitely enough space in there to mount the radiator, which is 20mm thick, and a 15mm high slim fan as well. Now I am just going to go and grab a mini ITX motherboard so we can double check that everything fits in here. So we have an Asus ROG Strix X670EI gaming Wi-Fi, and we are going to drop this in here to make sure that it fits. So obviously the I/O panel is down there, so I was playing with this motherboard earlier, so I should really have put the socket hat back on, but I've literally just taken it off to do some testing. So as you can see, plenty of clearance between the motherboard and the power supply. So that is super interesting. So for NZXT H2 owners, what you'll need to do is remove this bracket. You also need to, and in order to do that, you need to remove the kind of the strip down the bottom here, which looks like this. There's just a few screws holding this in. This is what the case chassis, the U-shaped chassis, just kind of slides in on. You need to remove that off one side, which allows you to get to the power supply bracket. So super cool options there if you have the smaller H1 version 2. Unfortunately, the graphics card that I've used, the Palette RTX 4070 Ti Gaming Pro, doesn't fit in this case. Otherwise, I would have probably gone for this one instead of the version 2, because there's actually better scope for water cooling in here. So clearly NZXT could definitely make a much more refined kind of extreme version of the H1 pretty easily, and include a 280mm liquid cooler in here, and just stick one of its 280mm Kraken AIO liquid coolers in here, or just have one for custom liquid cooling. So I would like to see that from NZXT for sure, because the NZXT H1 is looking a little dated now with its cooling options. That's it from Crazy Tech Lab today. I hope you've enjoyed our tweaking session with the NZXT H1 version 1 and version 2. All the hardware that I've used today is listed in the description above, and I make a small cut from the affiliate links listed up there. So show your support. If you do go to Amazon and buy those products, just use one of those links and I make a small cut, which just helps me make videos like this one. So if you've got any questions at all about the hardware or the cases that I've used today, always happy to answer your questions in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support. And don't forget to turn on those notifications so you are notified when I upload new awesome videos like this one. That's it from me. Hope to see you soon, and thanks for watching.